excited to welcome Mike Flynn to the table and pick up on a report that we didn't have a chance to get to at the February meeting, and probably better so that we didn't. And we promised you a more formal introduction of the work that Mike is leading. As you recall, Mike Flynn joined Destination Medical Center in November of last year, moved his family from Utah, where he had led for many years the Economic Development Initiative for the state of Utah, joined us to transfer those skills and those lessons to a very different context and a different demand. And now 6 months in, has a report to describe what we've been doing, how it's progressing, what is this muscle we need to build here in our community and in this organization. So with that, Mike, I'll let you take over.
Excellent.
And let me just interject and say, Mike, we are very excited that we have you here today and that you are on the agenda. We do have some informational items at the end, which we're slated to take up a few minutes. But I'm just going to ask Patrick to be very concise and selective about what we might want to pull out there. And I don't.
Those items are only for you as a board to decide if there's anything you want to.
Then I would encourage you to use the full amount of time that you need for your presentation, and I don't want to shortchange you today. So welcome, we're excited, and go ahead.
Thank you very much. I've really enjoyed the last 6 months here. There's been a lot of learning. I would say some starts and some stops as we've gone down different paths, trying to figure out what does this base of work look like here. I think kind of where we've settled at the 6 month mark, hopefully will be informative. I don't think this is probably where this ends, but we have done a lot and learned a lot that I think will be relevant here. The first thing I kind of want to sort of frame is, this is a quote that one of my mentors, a former mayor in Utah, shared with me once, and I think it's important here because I'm going to talk a lot about economic development, and what I've learned in my 6 months is, I think maybe my definition is a little bit different or a little bit more narrow than the definition that has existed here. So when I talk about economic development, I'm really talking about those two bolded, underlined areas on the right, and everything else is being done in this community currently and are all forms of economic development. So not to be dismissive when I say we are not doing certain things in economic development, we're really not doing certain things in business recruitment and business marketing. All of this other stuff is absolutely valid economic development. A lot of it has a very long track record in this community. I think it's been very successful in this community. But when I talk about some of the things that maybe have not happened in the past that we're trying to build now, it's really around those two sort of underlined data points. So I tend to think of building an economic development program sort of holistically, building a staff, building a budget, and it really, as far as what I've done in my career, kind of falls into these four buckets, these four pillars I talk about of building an economic development program. And all of them are important. I think in a community, what I would say is not all of them need to be done by the same entity. And there's a lot of groups around the country that play in 1, 2, or 3 of these areas and maybe don't have a program that encompasses all of them. I think what we're trying to build here is a program that would house some functionality in each one, but it's certainly not a requirement. Direct lead generation is just what it sounds like. It's us identifying companies and going out and talking to them. It tends to be probably a little bit slower work, a lot of data heavy work, but can be very productive once you sort of nail down the formula of who's a good target for you and what the message that will resonate with them is. It requires us to build processes, systems, messaging that doesn't currently exist, and so we've had to do some trial and error on that in terms of figuring out what that looks like. The number at the bottom of the page is really some sort of rough estimation in the last 6 months, the bulk of my time that's been spent in these areas. So you can see we spent a lot of time trying to build this part of the program. Reasoning for that is it's the easiest one to get sort of up and running. It's the easiest one to get some immediate returns on, and it's informative in other parts of the program that I'll talk about. Second is around what I would call sort of general awareness building. This is the broad-based marketing aspect of trying to get the world to understand what DMC is, what Rochester is, where it's at, what it includes, sort of what our broad value proposition is. We're not going to do that to the world. We're trying to figure out what audiences are the most relevant for us. It's a lot of corporate real estate. It's a lot of startup life science, a lot of established life science. Those tend to be very noisy markets. And so coming at this from sort of an infancy position has required us, I think, to to spend more time there. We've got to build content and we've got to develop those channels. Probably about 20% of my time in the last 6 months has been there. The two things on the right, so you can sort of think of the two things on the left as inputs, the things on the right are sort of outputs or supports. Research and data is really informative to all parts of this process, and it involves us getting smarter about this region, about what the value proposition of this region is and how that is going to resonate with the company that we sit down and talk to. So we've got to get smarter about sort of the economic characteristics of this market and communicate those in a way that's going to resonate with an expanding company. We have to get smarter about our site opportunities, both inside the DMC district and outside of the DMC district. Not every company we talk to, our 1 square mile is going to be a fit for. We don't want to push those companies to another community. We want to try and find a home for them in this community. And so it really requires us to be smart about a broader geography than just the DMC. And then to get smarter about our audiences. What do they think about this market? Do they think about this market? What perceptions do they have, good and bad? The bad perceptions, are they accurate? Or are they ill-informed? And if they're ill-informed, how do we go about sort of shifting those perceptions? So a lot of work to do there that really hasn't started yet. And the last piece of this is sort of the whole goal. It's the project management part of this. So when we do the other 3 things right, that will generate opportunities, things for us to work on. Companies that are trying to figure out, where do I park people or where do I park investment? And how do we compete on those opportunities when they come to us? There's not a lot of those in the system right now, as far as companies that are calling us saying, hey, I've got a dozen engineers I have to put somewhere, tell me about what the opportunity in Rochester is like. So I've not spent a lot of time there just because we don't have a lot of demand. I tend to be a visual learner. This in my mind is sort of how this all lays out. So lead gen starts first, minimal investment. It's really just a lot of sort of dialing for dollars. We kiss a lot of frogs, we get hung up on a lot, but we are identifying some prospects that have an investment to make and want to learn about this market. Awareness building generally takes longer and starts a little later. It tends to be more expensive, tends to consume more time, and we're beginning that process right now. For the research and data aspects of this, again, I mentioned feed into all parts of it. So in lead generation, we have to get smarter about who a good target is. You know, if we can take a list of 500 high growth companies and figure out who are the 50 that are going to respond to us, and we can do that by looking at different data or different analytics that we can purchase or create on our own, we get more efficient in that process. We're not getting hung up on a lot. We're identifying companies and we're sort of having that kismet moment where we say, can we tell you about Rochester? And they say, it's a great time and I'm trying to figure out where to put an investment. That's what we're ultimately working towards. Awareness building, you know, we've got to understand our audiences better. We are in the process right now of designing what I would sort of call the first broad-based awareness and perception study of Rochester as an economic development destination. So what do people think about us? What are those perceptions? And what perceptions, if we can change them, will increase the likelihood of somebody considering this market? My recommendation is this is a thing we should do every couple of years to sort of keep tabs on. Are we moving the needle? Are people becoming more aware? Is their perception improving? And do we have the right messaging towards that? And then research and data sort of funnels into the project management piece of this in terms of companies are going to call us with 1,000 questions, and we're going to have to be able to answer those quickly and accurately on what it is like to do business in this market. So that organization I worked at before, we had a team of people that just sort of worked in that gray bar in terms of providing data to the rest of the organization. So lead generation, I mentioned that's where we spent the bulk of our time. The work plan when I got here that sort of I inherited or that I am part of now does have some metrics around how many leads we're going to turn out in a given year out of this effort. And so sort of focus this program on some of those goals. Going forward for me, you'll see a lot of sort of snapshots like this. So these are the markets in which we conducted lead gen in the previous 6 months. You can sort of read the market and the date. That second line is how many targets, how many companies did we review that we decided to fit a profile that made sense for us to talk to. So those are the ones we reached out to. Below that, you can see the industries that those companies identify as. We looked at companies of all employment levels, so everything from 2-person operations to 1,000-person operations. We tend to look for companies that are taking on investment, actively taking on investment. And the reason for that is it tends to be a good indicator that there's some growth in their future. So there are probably a half a dozen different metrics we look for that historically, at least in my career, have been indicative of growth, and we try to pick companies that are doing those things. And 100% virtual, up until COVID, so I've done this part of economic development for a long time, and it was always a person-to-person, sort of across the table type of thing. With COVID, we pivoted this to 100% virtual, and have learned a couple interesting things out of that I think will inform our project going forward. So you can see out of San Diego, we identified 11 leads. We converted about 3% of our targets to leads. Not a terrible number for the first go-round, but certainly not where we want it to be. We focused on sort of what I would call mid-sized Midwestern markets in February. You can see did a little bit better out of that. And then as we do each one of these, we get smarter. We refine better. We improve our messaging. We kind of know what people are going to respond to. You can see in Canada, we really, I think, sort of hit on a formula that seemed to have worked, where all of a sudden that number jumps up a lot, and I think validates some of the learning. So about 65 leads in our system right now. These are companies that, again, have an investment or trying to figure out where to put it. And now Rochester and DMC is sort of in their consciousness as a place to potentially do that. So out of this process, some big questions in my mind is Patrick and I talked about, okay, we're at the 6-month mark. What does this look like at the 3-year mark? One big question is, how do we scale this? Each one of these campaigns generally takes a person a month between the pulling down the data, the vetting, the cleaning, the outreach, having meetings, having the follow-up. It's about a 4-week process from start to finish. So if you want to do one of these a month, you got to have staff and resource to do that. I mentioned the virtual aspect of this. Again, in my career, these have always been in person. The reality is the whole world learned how to do a Zoom call in the last 2 years. And so I don't know if this is an in-person business anymore, which is great for us because it makes it more efficient, it makes it more cost-effective. We used to budget about $100,000 a year in travel in my previous employer to execute on this, and I don't know if that's going to be a reality going forward. The other thing I mentioned, if you look at this one, the international numbers jumped a lot, and I think part of that is because our process got better. But the other thing we identified is the value proposition of this market to an international company is different from a domestic company. If you're in the States and you're selling into VA, or you are working through an FDA process, the value proposition of coming and doing that in Rochester, there's part of that that doesn't exist. But if you're in Canada, or you're in France, or you're in anywhere outside of the United States, you have to have a presence. And so the paradigm shifts a little bit, and we realized that pretty quickly into our conversations with these Canadian companies. There was an additional impetus for them that existed that I think made that campaign so successful. So I think going forward, when I got here, if you had asked me 6 months ago what % of our business is domestic versus international, I probably would have said 80% domestic, 20% international, because historically that's kind of where I've operated. I think there's a universe where that flips for us here, because what we're selling, I think it resonates pretty substantially differently to an international company as opposed to a domestic company. I think we still have to prove that out, but it's a sort of a big aha moment for me.
Yeah.
And the last one, obviously, is, so we have a lot of leads now. We have a lot of companies that are willing to look at opportunities. In my sort of the vernacular that I use, how do we turn those into a project which becomes much more real? It has an investment number, it has a headcount number, it has a timeline, it has a budget, it has all these things that are indicative of a real opportunity, as opposed to a lead which is maybe nothing more than a conversation. So 3 big things that we look at for the next year as far as moving this forward. I'm happy to pause there. I tend to talk faster than the average Minnesotan.
Member Williams.
Just a question. I raised this very briefly when we first met you, actually, about the relationship, particularly in that lead generation, any relationship to greater MSP and to D, who are also trying to generate leads. And I'm both thinking about it in terms of your point about, is there a broader geography out even beyond? I got to imagine, as you're talking to any potential company here, that you're selling both Rochester and the Mayo relationship, as well as the entire kind of region of Rochester, Twin Cities, even up to St. Cloud, that corridor.
Sure.
So I'm just curious if is there connections to some of those other entities and any kind of collaborative selling going on there?
So I think the short answer is yes. I've had conversations with the business development team from Deed about this process, and they've expressed some interest in trying to figure out what parts of it could be leveraged for areas of the state outside of Rochester. So a sort of a very timely example, if you look at where capital is currently flowing right now, there's a lot of it in the food business. Alternative protein source food production that was out of country that has been brought back post-COVID. There's a tremendous amount of investment there, and I worked on a lot of projects like that in Utah, and there's sort of two hallmarks. One is you want to be close to a consumer, which in this country is really 4 or 5 places. It's Southern California, or you want to be close to production, and we are sort of in the heart of production here. They tend to need a lot of water, they tend to need pretty robust transportation infrastructure. Anyway, this region, sort of broadly defined, I think could be very successful in attracting that type of investment. It's not going to be in Ford Discovery Square. You're not going to put a 1 million square foot, Impossible Foods plant, but that's the type of investment that I think could exist in this region, and I think those types of leads could come out of a process like this that I think we could be supportive of, or at least show them how we do it, so that other groups in the state can do the same.
I'll just add, I'm sorry, just to finish on that, I'm sorry, to add that we also are part of Greater MSP's Bio Innovation Grant submittal and have been supportive of that. And of course, Medical Alley is another full-on partner for the work that we're doing. So absolutely.
Member Baker?
I'd just add, Greater MSP is economic development for the counties around, and it's a distinct area. There was always debate about Rochester. It does not reach down there. I would say, as a person who's been on the other side, we would view Rochester, I think, positively as somewhat separate because of where people are going to live, schools, et cetera. I mean, all those things go into we're going to cite. The airport's obviously going to be an important part of transportation. I think what you're doing is great. This is being done. Food, finance, and I would say a number of sciences are the focus of Greater MSP already, just because we have a nucleus of those industries in that region. And it sounds like you're connected with Peter Frosch. And, as a chair, I started Greater MSP basically for the first 3 years. So it's great what you're doing. I have a question about, you've been here 6 months, it's early, but any insight on the importance of Discovery Square 3, i.e. GMP capabilities and, just wet lab? Boston sold out.
So I would say, and I had a data point that I pulled out in the interest of brevity, but the value proposition that we've tried a lot of different pitches as we've talked to these 100-odd companies, and the reality is Mayo is the bulk of the value proposition. But I will say, when we've talked about Discovery Square, the Innovation District, the potential for GMP space 2 blocks from the Mayo campus, we sort of try to read reaction. What are the parts of that generate a response? And probably second only to Mayo is that Innovation District especially when we talk to companies in San Diego. You can't find it, you can't afford to build it, you can't get it permitted. If you are in need of that space in that market, you're sort of out of options. We talked to a company in Madison. It's hard to find in Madison.
It's hard to find anywhere.
And so I think the short answer is yes. It is a part of our value proposition, second only probably to the Mayo conversation.
I only brought that up because I was on Holy Cross board, which is in Worcester, Mass. It was a armpit of New England up until maybe 7 years ago. And what's flipped it is, frankly, UMass building their medical research there and Boston being, frankly, sold out. You cannot get lab space, GMP space, anything in Boston. I mean, it's completely blocked. So is San Diego. Philly's becoming problematic, which is big pharma area too. So I just say the water seeks its own level, and there is some advantage. We had a number of GMP facilities they are very difficult to build and very difficult to run and to fund. So I do think there is some part of this. I don't know what the market study says or anything else, but there is some bill that they may come because the rest of the country is in a real shortage situation.
Member Campbell?
I think it's great that you're out there knocking on doors and telling this Rochester story to these companies across North America. The question I have is how much time do you think you're going to spend understanding the basic research that's going on here in Rochester and the potential of the growth of those businesses so that when something dramatic happens, the business stays here rather than going elsewhere? I mean, I know several examples of great products that have been developed here at Mayo, and then the company has been acquired and the jobs are created in another community across the country. And I think it's because potentially that we weren't as diligent in selling ourselves and trying to keep those jobs here. Myriad yesterday announced a $25 million injection in new capital. Myriad has moved their labs out to the IBM campus. Myriad has a working relationship with Regeneron right now, and I assume you're talking to Regeneron, I hope you are. But the hope is that when Myriad takes off, that it doesn't move to San Diego or to Boston or someplace else, but we're doing the marketing of the people that are already here to keep the jobs here.
So you're 100% right, and it is part of our program. What I am sort of talking about today is the outbound stuff. Chris Shad, who has been great to me in the last 6 months to sort of get me up to speed on a lot of the basic science, who's here, who's growing, what technologies have spun out. I think we have a very good handle on those through the work that he's done since he got to DMC, and we're just trying to supplement that with sort of this out-of-market stuff. But I feel confident that we've got a good handle on that.
Member Ryback?
Sitting on the Greater MSP board that Doug started and sitting on this has been super frustrating until recently when we recognized we're in the exact same business. And I credit the progress that's being made. We can and need to go further. And I do think it ties a little bit to this idea about in-person or not. The one thing that seems to be transitioning through the COVID period is not necessarily meetings, but conferencing. And there are so many discussions about going after big medical conferences with the Meet Minneapolis in Minneapolis. There's that conversation down here. We got to get over that, okay? The idea is we could be extraordinarily competitive in getting major players here for a visit if we combine the capacity of what's happening with Minneapolis and Meet Minneapolis and what's going on with Destination Medical Center. 3 days, 1 day, whatever else. We'll figure, the fact of the matter is that is not taking place enough. And I have really made that pitch to Meet Minneapolis in a huge way. And I really want to make it down here. We got to get over the idea that we're competing for events. We're in the same business, and hybrid or two location conferencing in those two places is a unique mix we have.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just jump in as the timekeeper here and just say you might want to have a short response on that, but
We can talk about it later.
and I also want to see if there's anything else you want to cover
Sure.
in a couple of minutes.
So awareness building, we are out sort of traveling the country, making sure the DMC flag is planted, and we're answering questions on who we are, what we're doing. Again, how do we scale this effort? How do we define success? Research and data, I really want to talk about this current marketing position study. Hopefully at a future meeting like this, we can report back on what is our baseline assessment for what people know, how people know this market. Project management, it's a lot about building capacity that just doesn't exist right now at DMC, internal capacity, external capacity, the whole gamut. I think this is an important one to end on. So trying to take everything that's gone on in the last 6 months and distill it down into 4 or 5 takeaways. The first is awareness and perception as an economic development destination is low. That is my anecdotal opinion. I think when we do this study, that will be validated with data that when these investments are taking place, people just don't think of us as a place to do it. And that's one of the big things we have to change. Second is when it comes to lead gen, the companies that are interested in talking to us tend to be younger, which means that process from lead to project to announcement is going to be longer. We can continue to try and improve that, but over the last 6 months, that's kind of what we've learned. The value proposition I think that resonates here first is the amount of innovation that comes out of this community is known and is significant. I think the second is the appetite or the potential for collaboration. People are wanting to collaborate. Can we connect those dots? It's going to be a big part of the value proposition. And the last, I think, is the commitment represented by DMC. The fact that an initiative of this scale exists in this community, this does not feel transitory. It feels like an established permanent thing, and I think people respond to that. The international opportunities, again, I mentioned, are significant. And I think going forward, this last bullet point maybe is a no duh, but so much of this stuff is going to scale linearly. If we have more capacity, we can do more things, and those things will result in quicker outcomes. So I think as we go into planning for next year, it's going to be important to figure out how do we scale parts of this as quickly as possible, so that we can see the results that I can feel are problem.
Well, Mike, we look forward to future conversations with you about what you continue to learn and a strategy to move those leads into real projects as quickly and dramatically as possible. So Patrick, any final comments from you?
No, I have no final comments. Thank you for addressing all of the issues in front of you, and the conversation and direction that we've received. Appreciate
Well,
it.
our appreciation to you and to all of